Chapter 15, Sharks and Bullets. On the 27th day, it began with a distant rumble, then a spot in the sky. It was a bomber moving briskly west. It was so far away that expending the flares and dye was questionable. The men decided to try. Louis fired two flares, drawing vivid lines across the sky. He spilled dye, then used the mirror to angle light toward the bomber. The men waited. The plane faded away. As the castaways slumped in disappointment, there was a glimmer on the horizon. The bomber was coming back. Crying with joy, Louis, Phil, and Mac waved and called out. The plane dropped, skimmed the water. Louis squinted at the cockpit. He saw two silhouettes, a pilot and a co-pilot. All at once, the ocean erupted. There was a deafening noise, and the rafts began hopping and shuddering. The plane's gunners were shooting at them. Louis, Phil, and Mac clawed for the raft's walls and threw themselves overboard. They swam under the rafts and huddled there, wincing, watching bullets cut through slits in the water around them. Then the firing stopped. The men surfaced. The bomber had overshot them. Two sharks were nosing around. The men had to get out of the water immediately. Trying to get onto Louis and Mac's raft, Phil floundered. Louis gave him a push, and Phil slopped on board. Mac, too, needed help. Louis dragged himself up, and the three sat, stunned but uninjured. They couldn't believe the airmen, mistaking them for Japanese, would strafe unarmed castaways. Beneath them, the raft felt so doughy. Bullets had struck it. It was leaking air. The bomber turned and flew toward the rafts again. Louis hoped the crew had realized their mistake and was returning to help. As the plane closed in, its side passed into view. All three men saw it at once. Behind the plane's wing, painted on the fuselage, was a red circle. The bomber was Japanese. As Louis turned to dive in the water, Phil and Mac didn't move. They were too weak to go back in the ocean. As the bomber flew toward them, they lay down. Phil pulled his knees to his chest and covered his head with his hands. Mac balled himself up beside him. Louis took a last glance at them, then dove under the rafts. The bullets showered the ocean in a glittering downpour. Louis saw them pop through the canvas, shooting beams of sunlight through the raft's shadow. After a few feet, they spent their force and fluttered down, fizzing. Louis pushed against the bottom of the raft, trying to get below the bullet's lethal range. Above, he could see the depressions of Mac's and Phil's bodies. Both were still. As the bullets raked overhead, the current began dragging Louis away. He knew if he lost touch with the rafts, he wouldn't be able to swim hard enough against the current to get back. As he was pulled loose, he saw a raft tether, grabbed it, and tied it around his waist. As he lay underwater, his legs tugged in from front of him. Louis looked at his feet, watching his sock flap in the current. Then, beyond it, he saw the huge gaping mouth of a shark emerging out of the darkness and rushing straight at his legs. Louis recoiled, swinging his legs to his side, but the shark kept coming directly at his head. He remembered the advice of the old man in Honolulu: make a threat, then stiff-arm the shark. As the shark lunged, Louis bared his teeth, widened his eyes, and rammed his palm onto the shark's nose. The shark flinched, circled away, then charged back. Louis until the shark was inches from him, then struck it again. Again, the shark peeled away. Shooting had stopped. Louis pulled himself along the tether, grabbed the raft wall, and scrambled aboard. Mac and Phil were still, bullet holes all around them. Louis shook Mac. Mac made a sound. Louis asked if he had been hit. Mac said no. Louis said he was okay. The bomber circled back. Phil and Mac played dead, and Louis tipped back into the ocean. As the bullets knifed the water around him, the shark came at him, and again Louis bumped its snout and repelled it. Then a second shark attacked. Louis hung there, flailing his arms and legs as the shark shot past. The moment the bomber sped away, he clambered onto the raft again. Phil and Mac were still unhit. For four more times, the Japanese strafed them, sending Louis into the water to kick and punch at the sharks. Each time he emerged, he was certain Phil and Mac would be dead. Impossibly, though there were bullet holes around the men, even in tiny space, not one bullet had hit either man. The plane returned, and Louis dove again. The bomb bay doors opened, and a depth charge, an underwater bomb, rolled out. The men braced for an explosion, but none came. Either the charge was a dud, or the bombardier had forgotten to arm it. Louis heaved back onto the raft and collapsed. When the bomber passed again, he was too tired to move. The gunners didn't fire. The bomber flew west and disappeared. Phil's raft was slashed in two, shrunken and formless. It lapped on the ocean surface. The men were sardined on Mac and Louis's raft, its canvas speckled with dozens of tiny bullet holes. Both of its air chambers were punctured. Each time someone moved, air sighed out, and the raft sat lower in the water. The sharks whipped around it, wildly excited. As the men sat, exhausted and in shock, a shark lunged onto the raft, mouth open, trying to drag a man off. Someone grabbed an oar and hit it, and it slid away. Then another shark jumped on, and after it another. The men wheeled about, frantically swinging at the sharks. As the men swung, the sharks flopped up. Air was forced out of the bullet holes, and the raft sank deeper. Soon the men's legs were underwater. If the men couldn't reinflate the raft immediately, the sharks would take them. Had been lost. Only one remained. The men hooked it to a valve and took turns pumping. Air flowed into the chamber and seeped out through the bullet holes. But if the men pumped very quickly, just enough air passed through the raft to lift it. The sharks kept coming, and the men beat them away. Louis groped for the patching kit, and as Phil and Mac pumped and fought sharks, he began the laborious task of gluing patches to the bullet holes. Sharks kept snapping at him. They began stalking about, waiting for a moment when an oar was down or a back turn before pulling their way aboard. Over and over they lunged at Louis from behind. Mac and Phil smacked them away. Hour after hour, the men worked, clumsy and with fatigue. All three were indispensable. Had there been only two, they couldn't have pumped, patched, and hit sharks. For the first time, Mac was truly helpful. Night fell. In the dark, patching was impossible, but the pumping couldn't be stopped. They pumped all night, so their arms went numb. In the morning, the patching resumed. The rate of air loss gradually lessened. Once the top was patched, they had to patch the bottom. All three squeezed onto one side of the raft. They deflated the other side, lifted it up, turned it over, and let it dry. Then Louis patched as the other two pumped and struck sharks. When that half was patched, they re-inflated it, crawled onto the repaired side, deflated the other side, and began again. Finally, they could find no more holes. Because bubbles kept coming in from below, they knew there were holes they couldn't reach. They had to live with them. The patches had slowed the air loss dramatically. They cut back on pumping to once every 15 minutes or so by day, and none at night. With the raft reinflated, the sharks stopped attacking. The crisis over, Louis and Phil thought about the bomber. They thought it must have come from the Marshall or Gilbert Islands, which were probably roughly equidistant from them. It had probably been on sea search and likely took off at around 7 a.m., a few hours before it reached the rafts. Estimating the bomber's cruising speed and range, they made rough calculations to arrive at how many hours the bomber could remain airborne after it left them, and thus how far they were from its base. Crunching these numbers, they guessed that they were some 850 miles from the base. If this was correct, given they'd crashed about 2,000 miles east of the Marshalls and Gilberts, they'd already traveled more than half the distance to them, covering more than 40 miles per day. They'd had no idea they were so far west. Using these figures, they made educated guesses of when they'd reach the islands. Phil guessed the 47th day, Louis guessed the 47th. This would mean surviving on the raft for almost 3 more weeks. As frightening as it was to imagine what might await them on those islands, it was good to know land lay somewhere ahead. The bomber had given them something on which to ground their hope. Mac didn't join in the conversation. He was slipping away. And okay, we'll get to the next chapter, chapter